Y'all, it is time for our Q&A for the week. So just gonna go ahead and jump right into our questions based on this week. First question that we had was based on our Leviticus reading in chapter 27, 1 through 8. Can you elaborate on a special vow to the Lord involving valuation of persons and why females would be valued at such a lower rate? So basically, Leviticus 27 begins with these vows that the Israelites might make to God to dedicate themselves or someone else, usually a relative, to service of God. Now, vow in the Old Testament was a promise that one doesn't have to make, but once they are made, once that vow is made, it has to be kept. Most famous example of this that I can think of is in 1 Samuel 1, where Hannah does this with her son Samuel. She makes a vow, she makes a dedication. This is my son is going to be dedicated unto the Lord. The point was to offer of this type of vow was to offer yourself or a child, particularly maybe another relative somewhere here or there, but usually someone close to you. Usually, we're making such a promise in hopes that the Lord would do something in turn for the maker of the vow, and usually was kind of done in moments of desperation. And so these were vows that were made. They had to be kept. They had to be fulfilled. But the Lord did not want people to just be oppressed by them. So there was a way to have somebody redeemed or bought back from that particular vow. And as in regards to why there was different valuations for males and females, and actually ages is included in that as well. Really and truly, it just boils down to is who could be expected to do more work. Remember, you're talking about an agrarian society, and this is not meant to be misogynistic, sexist, or any other way, but in general, males, particularly adult males, are more physically able to do hard labor, like out in the field. Men, remember, we're talking about an agrarian society. We're not talking about a time today where the necessity for the physical is not quite as necessary in a lot of our different fields that we have job wise today. But this is a merciful law. It's there so that that people who've made a vow will have to live up to it. I've had to actually go through this as a landowner down in Dorchester County. Um, Long story short, we went through a process where somebody wanted to buy a parcel of our land. And so when we laid out the contract, they laid out there, hey, we're going to buy this land, and to guarantee we're going to buy this land, we're going to put up this amount of money to you. And if we don't end up buying the property after we've done all of our evaluation, we're still going to give you that amount of money. And so we had some land for sale. They ended up not buying it, and therefore the money that they'd pledged to, for the basically kind of our time and effort in going through this process. But it was a vow they'd made. We were going to try to see this through, and if we don't see it through, this is what we owe you. So I hope that kind of makes sense. But basically, that's what it's about. It's about somebody who's made a vow and they need to follow through with it, but they're ready to kind of be bought out of it or redeemed by it. And so that is what the process is on that. By the way, we see Jesus there is that he is the redemption. He's the one who's purchased us from the punishment of God. And that kind of leads to our next question, also in Leviticus 29. Where the question is based on, it says, verse 29 says, no human has been devoted to destruction can be redeemed. He must be put to death. What does this mean? That's the question. You need to read this in addition to verse 28. That's one of the things is let's not separate those two verses kind of need to be put together. And in verse 28, we're told of, that this is basically the our type of setting apart of an item for God, particularly for sacrifice. That something that was dedicated was to be dedicated to the Lord. There's no redemption. Again, a sacrifice coming unto the Lord. That was supposed to be permanent consecration. In regards to to verse 29, this is one of those harder passages. I must admit, I had to look it up and make sure I knew what I was talking about. But basically, the way that most scholars would say is one is that this is a Hebrew way of saying that no one who has been given the death penalty for a capital crime can be redeemed. He must die. But also, that this is in reference to public enemies of Israel and therefore of God uh, by the appointment of God. And so we actually see this that's going to come up in the book of Joshua, where the city of Jericho was devoted to destruction. We see it also in Judges when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead were put to death for violating the curse pronounced upon those who came up to Mizpah. And also we see it again in 1 Samuel 15, where King Saul is commanded to bring God's judgment against the Amalekites, and they were devoted and doomed to destruction. And of course, Saul disobeys God in that case. Um, so that's a hard verse. It's not one that's easily understood. However, there is some Jesus redemption here because it's a foreshadowing of Jesus' sacrifice, where he took on the penalty of sin, that he was, sin that was devoted to destruction. We are devoted to destruction because of our sin, but Christ took that on the behalf of humanity, allowing for redemption where otherwise there wouldn't be any. Essentially, Jesus again becomes the ultimate sacrifice, atoning for our sin. It's a great question. One of those hard passages to understand. Um, then we go back. I got another question here on Leviticus 25, talking about the year of Jubilee. If you want to hear more about Jubilee, actually show up this Sunday, as I'll actually be preaching on that topic. But the goes on and talking about the question goes on with makes me wonder about the Jewish calendar, how the Jewish calendar got started, how it works, what are the major holidays or observances? They still following it today? Are there still yearly observances? Yes, there are. All of these different feasts and things for the Jewish calendar get their start in, particularly here in the Pentateuch, with all of the different feasts that are listed: Passover, Pentecost, Tabernacles. There's some other ones in there: first fruits, trumpets. And Day of Atonement as well. Those are all major holidays. They're still celebrated. I would say that there are sects of Judaism that follow it far more closely, and all the different ones. There's some who do it religious. That's gonna sound weird. There's some who do it very frequently, and some who do it infrequently, and maybe not exactly. But again, in Christian circles, we don't typically celebrate this unless we're kind of reflecting back on what did this mean in its original context and what does it mean to us today. But we don't follow it. But it is still followed today in the Jewish calendar. Just to kind of give you an idea, heads up on what that means. The Passover is celebrated on the 14th day of the first month. This year, that'll be April 12th through the 20th. By the way, that's based on the lunar calendar. The Feast of Pentecost or the Feast of Weeks, same thing. Celebrated 50 days after Passover. This year it'll be June 1st. Feast of Tabernacles is celebrated in the middle of the seventh month. Based on lunar calendar this year, that'll be October 7th to the 13th. It's actually several big things that happen in the month, that little couple weeks there, the last of September, beginning of October. There are a couple of other Jewish festivals that are listed in Scripture. The Feast of the First Fruits celebrated the day after the seventh day of Passover, so that'll be April 20th this year. The Feast of Trumpets celebrated as the first day of the seventh month, which is the Jewish New Year. Again, I don't know why it's the seventh month, but oh well, it is. Today or this year, that's September 23rd. We probably know that feast better as if you know the Jewish holidays. We know it better as Rosh Hashanah. Is probably rather than Feast of Trumpets, but it's the same thing. And then Day of Atonement celebrated the 10th day of the seventh month. That's October 1st and 2nd of 2025 this year. Again, good question. We don't celebrate those as Christians, we or observe them, but they are good for us to at least know and kind of know what they are referring to. Another question that came up in our Q&A this time was if they needed manna and quail, where did all of the animals come from for the offering? What's the timeline for manna and offerings? Well, this is a very good question because that does lead to, okay, wait a minute. Why, if we know there's all these offerings that are coming up, why, if they have all these animals, why would they need the manna and quail? Well, the best that we know of is that they actually left Egypt with the plunder, including a ton of this livestock. Now, why didn't they just eat that for the whole thing, for the people and everything, just to remain alive and everything? Uh, the best answer is yes, they left with a lot of plunder from Egypt, but when you consider how many hundreds of thousands, if not million or so people were there in Israel, they would have quickly run through those. But probably more importantly, and best guess, it's never spelled out in scripture why they didn't just eat those animals. But best guess is there's a potential, that they are coming out of Egypt. They've been there for 400 years. They've learned a lot of Egyptian culture. There's probably some things they picked up on worship of animals, and so it's just kind of to eat those animals might be weird. But I'll give you a more that's scholars have that as out there. I don't put a lot of stock into that. What's more likely is that all of this livestock is an economic thing. They're sources of income, and so you know, it it would be hard to give that up. Now, again, you're going to give it up in a sacrificial system, but there's still some kind of payment back, and it's not as though you're doing it, every meat for every meal, feeding a family or anything like that. But I guess the bigger point is it's not just that the Israelites lacked, meat or whatever food, whatever else. It was really about their lack of faith. And the Lord providing the quail and the manna. Again, great question. Absolutely wonderful question. And I'm doing my best guess on why, yeah, we know for sure they got the plunder from Egypt. That's no doubt. And then of course there'll be subsequent battles that they win that they get more plunder from. But why they didn't just eat those, best guess is again, it was a source of income and they lacked the faith to trust in God. So there. And then the final question, and boy, I had forgotten that this passage was here so early in Numbers 5. I knew it was coming up. I just forgot that it was Numbers 5. But it is a weird section of scripture. It's about the whole thing about there's a jealous husband and he brings the wife and they bring to the priest and she has to take down her hair and drink this water to figure out if she's committed adultery or not. And I'm not kidding you. So the question that came up is here's what it says. Oh, and that's my wife. Sorry. Uh, I should remember to pause my phone when I'm on Facebook Live. But Numbers 5, the question is, I'm hoping you can explain why there seems to be a double standard against women. Also says to let the hair of the woman's head down. What does that mean? And twice it says being under the authority of your husband, so that it almost sounds like she has no choice. And if the husband is jealous, whether for good reason or not, he can make her go through this law of jealousy. Sounds kind of messed up to me. Hopefully, you can explain what's happening here. Well, I hope I can explain it as well. Not an easy thing. This is a very strange sounding passage, Troyers, and admittedly, it sounds misogynistic. But I want to say that this actually provides protection for the wife. And again, it may not seem it to our 2025 understanding. Uh, but it does actually do that. Now, granted, this does kind of look like a trial by ordeal that was done in Mesopotamia, if you know any of your history, or more famously in the Salem witch trials, where hey, we're going to put you in, we're going to dunk you underwater. If you drowned, you were innocent. If you float, you were not. You're guilty of witchcraft. It sounds like a terrible way, a terrible system. Or that sounds along the lines of the witch trial in Monty Python's Search for the Holy Grail. She's a duck. She's a witch. But anyway, in those cases, only a miracle would save the innocent in those trials by ordeal. But in this scenario that is laid out here in Numbers 5, it would be a miracle if an innocent woman was proven guilty by the trial. In fact, she was naturally protected by the process, not threatened by it. If you read the passage and read what's going on there, there's nothing intrinsic about the elements that are being used that would seem to harm her. There's nothing about the water or even the dust from the tabernacle floor that would harm her if she were an adulteress, just by that. Remember, it says that it's holy water. So it's water that's used in the basin of cleansing. So this would have been probably the cleanest water in the entire camp. That was being used. And again, just dust from the tabernacle. We're not talking about a ton of dirt, just a little sprinkling. Probably still. I mean, remember, this is not the day in which you have purified water or a water bottle or anything like that. You're drinking from whatever source, and there are other things that are drinking from those sources as well. And so probably, this is the cleanest water, so there's nothing intrinsic about the water that should have harmed them. And so and so if there was that, for lack of a better term, that getting sick or being in pain, it would only be because of God's judgment that she was truly guilty. This is one of those times where, again, we have to stop thinking like we're in 2025, and think about what's going on in this time. And so, in this case, just drinking the water should have no effect unless the person is truly guilty, and that is a supernatural act of God. As for some of the other questions within this, as for the uncovering of her head and her hair being loosened, this was to symbolize her being placed under God's direct judgment and temporarily removing her husband's authority. In this case, it's a sign of vulnerability and submission to God's judgment. But again, being placed under God's judgment and not the husband's judgment. Um, and really and truly, again, why was this done? Y'all, I wish this was spelled out more clearly in Scripture. Best guess that I can give you is that it served to resolve a crisis situation in the law where a lack of knowledge could lead down to a breakdown of all trust within a marriage, but also that a vulnerable party could be suffering under false accusation. It promised either divine vindication or divine release or divine proof that the party is innocent. Excuse me. That means that's the same thing as vindication. I got my words confused. I just messed up. It was either a sign of divine vindication of the person and their innocence, or a sign of their judgment of that actually happened. As to another question that kind of came up, why was there not a similar mandate for a jealous wife? My best answer to that is, as Reb Tevye says in Fiddler on the Roof when discussing why they wear their hats and their prow shawls, and he says, "You may ask, how did this tradition start? I tell you, I don't know." And that is my best answer. I have no idea why there's not a similar trial listed for a jealous wife. I just have no idea. By the way, in regards to other adulterous situations, but this is a situation where a husband just has a suspicion. There's no proof. He's jealous. He thinks, but he has absolutely no proof. Um, there are other passages in scripture that deal with when you know, when it's been proven, when for a fact somebody is guilty of adultery. There are passages there that handle that, and so that it's definitely different than this. Anyway, guys, I hope that answers your questions as best I can. Feel free to ask me again. I'm going to post my answers here in just a minute when I'm through. But again, I appreciate all of y'all's questions. I really enjoy doing this with you guys and hope that this has been helpful. Anyway, we will talk to y'all later. Have a wonderful day. Bye bye.